Hey folks, imagine waking up at dawn in a muddy 12th century village, the chill of damp straw seeping into your boots, and the only forecast you have is a sparrow's silhouette flickering across a thatched roof. Yeah, medieval farmers read bird shadows like today's meteorologists read apps. And trust me, the stakes were a lot messier than a missed coffee run. Before we dive into the feather-filled folklore, smash that like button if you love a good old-school survival hack. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Maybe you've ever tried to guess rain by a pigeon's pooch. Dim the lights, grab a warm mug, and picture the sharp, earthy scent of wet loam as you step outside, squinting at the sky while a rook spins above the wheat, its wing casting a fleeting, silvery stripe that farmers swear could tell if tomorrow's harvest will be soggy or sunny. Did the crow's shadow stretch to the east? They'd mutter, as if the birds were tiny, weather reporting drones powered by feathers and caffeine. You'll soon hear why a crow perched on a scarecrow was basically the medieval equivalent of a weather radar, only more dramatic and a lot less reliable than your smartphone. So, are you ready to trade your forecasting apps for a medieval bird watching cheat sheet? Let's get into the gritty, feather-filled details. In the low morning mist of a 12th century English valley, young Aldrich followed the slow steps of his grandmother, the village's seasoned shadow watcher. Through dew-slick furrows, the earth smelled of damp loam and the faint iron of distant ironworks, while a handful of sparrows traced soft silhouettes across the barley. Grandmother's hand, calloused yet gentle, pointed at the lengthening dark bars and whispered that the sun's angle and the bird's shade foretold the weather ahead. Aldrich felt the cool breath of the valley settle on his neck, a quiet promise that even the smallest mark could hold meaning. Thus began his quiet apprenticeship, measured by the slow swing of a shepherd's crook and the steady flicker of shadow /P. The week grew darker as clouds gathered, pressing low against the hills like a sigh that threatened to swallow the fields. Aldrich watched the crows settle on the newly sown wheat, their shadows stretching thin and wavering, and sensed a tension that mirrored the tightening ropes of the harvest wagon. The village elders gathered beneath a thatched roof, listening to the rustle of parchment and the low murmur of rain on stone, each waiting for the shadow watcher's verdict. Grandmother's voice, now a low hum, warned that a sudden shift in the birds' silhouettes could spell a storm that would drown the sprouting stalks. The air tasted of cold iron and wet wool, and the farmers' faces hardened, their eyes fixed on the ground where light and darkness fought for dominance. /P. When the first raven took flight, its elongated shadow fell unusually long across the furrow, prompting a soft chuckle from the youngest laborer, who claimed the bird was merely chasing its own tail. The irony lay in the fact that the same shadow interpreted by tradition as a sign of gentle rain, now seemed to mock their anxious preparations. Grandmother, eyes narrowed against the pale sky, allowed a brief smile to slip through the serious lines of her face, as if the birds themselves were aware of the human's clumsy reliance on silhouettes. The villagers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, while others muttered about the absurdity of trusting a feathered outline for the season's fate. Yet the shadow lingered, flickering like a candle in a draught, leaving the field awash in a muted, contemplative light. /P. As the clouds softened and a thin drizzle settled, the shadows shortened, and the field exhaled a faint, earthy scent that seemed to approve the quiet patience of the farmers. Aldrich, now more steady in his steps, helped his grandmother straighten the thatch on the village hall, the rhythm of the hammer matching the gentle patter of rain on the thatched roof. The men and women returned to their tasks, their movements slow and deliberate, as if each grain of soil carried a memory of the earlier uncertainty. The sky turned a muted amber, and the birds settled low, casting modest silhouettes that confirmed the weather's temperance. In that lingering hush, the village found a calm steadiness, the work of the day flowing like a slow river beneath the soft glow of an overcast sun. /P. When the harvest moon rose, gilding the fields with a mellow light, Aldrich stood beside the emptied granary, feeling the cool stone under his fingertips and the distant echo of laughter that had once filled the evenings. He reflected on how a simple play of light and shade had guided the collective hands that now stored the season's bounty. A reminder that human foresight often rests on the most modest of signs. Grandmother's weather-worn hands rested on his shoulder, their quiet grip speaking of years spent watching the same shadows and learning the value of measured expectation. The village slept beneath the same veil of mist that had greeted them at dawn, the air scented with dried wheat and faint pine, a gentle proof that time smooths both fear and hope. In the soft silence, Aldrich understood that the true forecast was not in the birds' shadows, but in the steady patience of those who chose to listen. /P. In the cool blush of dawn, Aldrich stepped onto the tilled field, the dew clinging to his boots like tiny glass beads. He watched a handful of sparrows flit between the newly sprouted barley, their silhouettes stretching thin across the wet earth. The length of each bird's shadow seemed to whisper of the day ahead, a subtle language the farmers had learned to read over generations. Beside him, his neighbor Maud lifted a wooden rake, listening to the soft rustle of leaves as a faint wind teased the horizon. Together, they noted the first amber line of light, already beginning to outline the sky's hidden moods. As the sun climbed, the sparrows' shadows grew longer, reaching farther across the furrows, a quiet signal that moisture hung in the air. Aldrich felt the air thicken, the scent of wet soil rising from the low ground, and the low murmur of distant clouds rolling like slow cattle. The farmers exchanged brief glances, the tension of impending rain settling into their shoulders like a damp cloak. Maud tightened the strap of her sack, feeling the weight of grain against her side, aware that the longer shadows meant the fields would soon drink. The world seemed to hold its breath, the light waning just enough to make the future feel both inevitable and uncertain. When a sudden gust turned the sun's angle, the sparrows' shadows snapped to the opposite side, casting brief, sharp lines that seemed out of place on the now brightening field. The unexpected shift startled Aldrich, whose practiced eyes read it as a warning of a storm that might break without warning. Yet the sky remained stubbornly clear, the clouds stubbornly refusing to gather, and the rain never fell. The farmers exchanged a half smile, the irony of their age-old code meeting a day that refused to cooperate. In the gentle laugh that rose from Maud's throat, the tension dissolved into a soft, shared acknowledgement of nature's capricious humor. When the sun steadied, the shadows settled into their ordinary length, and the field exhaled with a warm, dry breeze that brushed the wheat tops. Aldrich lowered his gaze to the soil, feeling the firm, sun-warmed earth under his fingertips, and the rhythm of his work returned to its familiar cadence. The birds resumed their quiet chorus, the sparrows now perched calmly, their silhouettes blending into the background like old friends. The farmhands continued their tasks, the day moving forward with a calm that felt as steady as the turning of a millstone. In the soft glow of late afternoon, the world seemed to settle into a gentle, unhurried sigh as twilight painted the hills in muted terracotta. Aldrich lingered by the fence, pondering how the subtle play of light had guided his hands all season. He sensed a quiet humility in the fact that such small observations could shape the harvest, a reminder of human fragility against the vast sky. The lingering scent of damp earth and the distant lowing of cattle formed a lullaby of ordinary miracles. Maud joined him, her eyes half closed, and together they watched the final shadows shrink, feeling a soft gratitude for the days when the birds had spoken. In the lingering hush, the farmers understood that each measured shadow was a brief conversation with a world that never hurried, and that their lives, like the fading light, were a series of patient pauses. In the low hills, where the wheat fields stretched like faded ribbons, Aldrich, the reaper, stood each dawn, watching the thin silhouettes of larks and sparrows dance across the soft earth. The village folk trusted the length of a swan's shadow at sunrise to tell whether the soil would hold moisture, and the quiet rustle of feathers had become a calendar older than the stone well. On mornings when the mist lingered, the shadows grew long and thin, a subtle cue that the air would stay mild. Aldrich, with his weather-worn cap and calloused hands, kept a notebook of these fleeting outlines, noting how the crow's dark shape fell across the furrowed furrow. The rhythm of light and shade stitched the days together, a calm ledger of the seasons. When the first chill of autumn whispered along the ridge, the villagers felt a tightening in their throats as the sowing deadline approached. A cold front, invisible in the sky, pressed against the hills and threatened to freeze the newly broken soil before the seeds could root. Aldrich rose earlier than usual, eyes narrowed on the crow that now perched on the thatched roof, its shadow stretching across the thatch like a thin blade. The gathered women and boys whispered, their breaths forming small clouds, as they waited for the bird's movement to confirm whether the wind would turn hostile. The tension settled like a thin layer of frost on the window panes, each heartbeat sinking with the slow crawl of the shadow across stone. As the crow shifted, its shadow slipped oddly across a dry patch of ground, resembling a brief, bright line that Aldrich had once taken to mean a passing warm breeze. In a quiet moment of confidence, he announced that the storm would pass, and the sowing should begin that very afternoon. A decision taken with the same steady voice he used to measure grain. The villagers, trusting his seasoned eye, hurried to the fields, their tools clinking softly against the chilled earth as they scattered seed into soil that still held a lingering chill. Within hours, a sudden gust carried a thin layer of sleet, dampening the fresh rose and turning the effort into a slick, sinking mess. The irony of the misread shadow lay heavy, a soft chuckle of fate that the villagers recognized only after the dampened stalks bent under unexpected weight. The storm moved on, leaving the sky a pale, steady gray, and the villagers gathered under the low beam of the communal fire, their faces illuminated by the gentle orange glow. Aldrich, his cheeks flushed from the cold, listened as the elder women spoke in low tones about the day's mistake, their words neither harsh nor blaming, merely noting the thin line between observation and assumption. Together they repaired the furrows, pulling stones and smoothing soil with careful, methodical motions that echoed the earlier rhythm of watching shadows. The evening air grew warmer, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint hum of crickets, a calm that settled over the fields like a soft blanket. In the quiet that followed, the village found a renewed steadiness, each movement measured, each glance at the sky a reminder of both frailty and resilience. Later, as the wheat shoots rose, their green tips catching the late sun, Aldrich reflected on the day's lesson that even the most trusted signs can be clouded by haste. He closed his notebook, the pages now marked with a single, faint correction beside the crow's outline, a reminder that vigilance must be paired with patience. The villagers, their faces softened by years of labor, continued their work with a slower, more attentive pace, the occasional glance upward now accompanied by a brief pause. The unseasonable storm became a quiet story told over meager meals, its irony softened by the rhythm of seasons that inevitably returned. In the hush of twilight, the village rested, cradled by the steady pulse of earth and sky, aware that humility lies in listening to the smallest shadows. In early spring, the village of Thistlebrook lay beneath a low horizon, where fields of barley rose in thin green ribbons, and the river whispered over smooth stones. Aldrich, a farmer of stout hands and patient eyes, kept a notebook of bird shadows, noting how the crows' silhouettes slipped westward at dawn. The village elders taught that the length and direction of those shadows could foretell rain, a lesson passed down from a blurred figure whose face the sun never revealed. Each morning, Aldrich watched the sky's pale glaze, feeling the cool breath of wind brush his cheek as sparrows fluttered low. He traced the slow sweep of raven shadows across the stone wall, a quiet ritual that seemed as ordinary as the scent of freshly turned soil. The rhythm of the day settled into a gentle cadence, as steady as the turning of the water wheel nearby. One crisp morning, a dozen ravens gathered on the ridge, their bodies casting elongated silhouettes that stretched far across the western field. The shadows converged into a thin, crooked line that pointed directly toward the hills, a formation the old notes described as a warning of a great tempest. A low rumble rolled from the distant clouds, and the scent of wet earth rose, heavy as iron in the air. Aldrich felt the tension in the taut rope of his thoughts as children paused mid-play, looking up with wide eyes. He called the villagers together, his voice low but steady, describing the rare alignment of shadows that the elders had only whispered about. The sky darkened, and the first cold drop struck the thatch, confirming the ominous promise that the birds had silently delivered. While some villagers muttered about superstition, others chuckled nervously, recalling stories of prophets whose faces were forever hidden in storm-lit haze. Aldrich, however, simply lifted a sack of grain and placed it in the storehouse, his movements unhurried, as if the clouds were merely passing clouds. The irony lay in how a simple play of light on feathered wings could outpace the grand roar of thunder that threatened to drown the fields. A few skeptical men lingered by the well, their boots splashing in the rising puddles, yet they could not deny the quiet certainty in Aldrich's gaze. As the first heavy gust swept the low hills, the villagers found themselves sheltering livestock beneath thick oak branches, their breaths forming faint clouds in the cold air. The storm's fury unfolded with a measured intensity, and the village's routine adjusted itself like a slow, deliberate dance. When the rain finally fell in earnest, it drummed against the thatch roofs with a steady, muffled percussion, while the river swelled, its surface rippling under the weight of countless drops. Aldrich guided the cows into the sturdy stone barn, feeling the dampness cling to his woolen cloak, and he carefully stacked bundles of wheat against the wall, the grains scent sweetening the chill. The villagers moved in quiet coordination, their hands brushing straw, their voices hushed, as they secured doors and covered open windows with oilcloth. Outside, the wind howled through the fields, bending the stalks of barley like tired soldiers. Yet the shadow lore had spared the harvest from ruin. By the faint glow of a smoldering hearth, Aldrich sat, watching the flicker of flames mirror the dwindling storm beyond the shutters. The night stretched on, the rain gradually thinning, leaving a serene, damp hush over the countryside. At dawn the clouds thinned, unveiling a sky brushed with pale amber, and the village emerged from its temporary shelter with soft footsteps on wet cobblestones. Aldrich walked along the fence line, feeling the cool mud between his boots, and noted how the wheat swayed undamaged, a quiet testament to the old shadow teachings. The villagers gathered near the well, sharing warm broth and half-smiles, their conversation slow, as if savoring the stillness that followed the storm. In the quiet moments, they reflected on how an unnoticed shift of a bird's silhouette had guided their actions more reliably than any louder proclamation. The day settled into a gentle routine, the fields glistening with residual moisture, and Aldrich closed his notebook, content that the ancient, blurred wisdom continued to serve the humble lives below. A subtle gratitude lingered in the air, a soft acknowledgement that human imperfection often finds refuge in the simplest of observations. When the first thaw brushed the low hills, the village field hands rose with the thin light that stretched across the thatch roofs. Their eyes lifted to the low sky, where sparrows traced thin bands across the mud-slicked earth, casting fleeting shadows on the freshly turned soil. The quiet murmur of the brook and the rustle of wheat stalks formed a backdrop for a practice older than any written record, a patient watching that turned habit into habit. Each farmer noted how a robin's silhouette lingered longer on a south-facing ridge when a cold front gathered, a detail recorded in the back of a worn ledger made of goat skin parchment. The day unfolded slowly, the air warm enough to coax the insects from the hedgerows, and the shadows seemed to promise a gentle season. Midsummer arrived with a weight of humidity that clenched the village in a low, humming heat, and the birds began to shift their flight paths as if feeling a pressure beneath the clouds. A flock of starlings slipped low over the barley, their shadows stretching thin and trembling against the golden heads, a sign the elders whispered could foretell rain. The farmers felt a quiet unease as the air grew thick, the scent of wet earth rising from distant damp fields, and the faint croak of frogs grew louder. They gathered around the communal fire, tracing the fleeting silhouettes on their hands, debating whether to hasten the sowing or wait for the sky's decision. The tension rested in the silences between their words. Each pause a small breath held against an unseen storm. When the first drops fell, they arrived not as a steady drizzle, but as a sudden, sharp burst that rattled the roof thatch like a restless drum. The shadows of the crows that had perched on the scarecrow had been short and abrupt, a detail the ledger had marked as a warning of fierce wind. Yet the wind arrived calm, merely spreading the rain across the fields. The farmers laughed quietly, the irony of their careful signs meeting a softer reality, softening the earlier worry, like a child shrugging after a mistake. They wiped their faces with rough sleeves, feeling the coolness of rain on their skin, and noted the variance in the ledger with a steady hand, a small smile playing on their weary features. In the gentle patter, the day settled into a rhythm that felt both absurd and comforting. After the storm passed, the sky cleared to a pale amber, and the wheat bowed under a sheen of lingering dew, each stalk reflecting the day's labor in a quiet glitter. The farmers moved methodically, gathering the golden harvest, while the bird shadows, now longer and softer, drifted lazily across the fields, their silhouettes serving as a final ledger entry of the day's weather. They inscribed the observations, the length of the skylark's shade, the angle of the jay's silhouette, onto the same goat skin pages, stitching together a simple code of symbols that could guide the next planting season. The sounds of scythes cutting through stalks blended with low chuckles, the pace unhurried as the evening light painted the horizon in a warm terracotta glow. With each measured step, the community felt the calm of completion settle over them, a shared acknowledgement of work done and knowledge preserved. When the harvest was stored in the cool cellar, and the fields rested under a blanket of night, the oldest farmer closed the ledger, its pages now thick with strokes of shadow and light. He placed the book on the wooden bench beside the hearth, where the fire's glow flickered quietly, as if inviting the next generation to trace the same lines with their own fingertips. The village children, eyes half closed from a day's toil, listened to the soft rustle of the pages, feeling a gentle connection to the unseen sky that had guided their ancestors. In the stillness, the lessons settled like dust on a shelf, that human imperfection can be softened by careful observation, and that even the smallest bird can teach patience. The night deepened, and the world breathed out a slow, contented sigh, the legacy of shadow watchers lingering like a faint perfume of wheat and earth. Mist rolls over Eldermore Valley as market stalls stir to life. Young apothecary Myra adjusts the weight of a jar of dried lavender, her eyes catching the early crows perched on the stone towers. Brother Aldrich, weather watcher, leans against a wooden beam, his fingers tracing the grain as he greets her with a measured nod. Villagers murmur about the low, humming wind and the sheep that huddle in the shade of the old oak, trading stories that animals whisper of rain. The two agree to listen, noting each feathered circle and each animal's posture as a possible omen for the king's harvest council. As the sun wanes, a chill creeps across the cobbles, and a flock of crows spirals lower, their black wings beating a nervous rhythm. Myra feels the tightness of her apron, the scent of wet earth already faint as a promise. Aldrich watches a herd of sheep lower their heads, the wool dampening, and he notes the shiver in their backs, a sign the rain may arrive before nightfall. The market's chatter sharpens, merchants arguing over the safety of their grain, while the baker wipes flour from his hands, fearing a damp ruin. The tension hangs like a low cloud, each animal motion becoming a silent ledger of an uncertain sky. Yet the crows simply circle the highest tower because it offers the clearest view, not because they hold counsel of the heavens. The sheep huddle low not from prophetic instinct, but from the cool shade of the oak that brushes against the wind. Aldrich smiles wanly, aware that the villagers' earnest interpretations turn ordinary behavior into grand augury, a modest comedy of hopes. Myra chuckles softly, the ironies of their trade flickering like candlelight on parchment, while the market's rhythm continues unchanged. In the soft dusk, the animals continue their simple routines, unaware that humans have woven them into forecasts of harvest and loss. Deciding to put the observations on paper, Myra pulls a clean scroll, the fibers cool under her fingertips. Aldrich sets a small wooden box of ink beside her, its lid creaking gently as he opens it. Together they record the crow's descent, the sheep's posture, the temperature of the stone walls, each entry noted with a measured hand and a steady breath. The market quiets around them, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer becoming a metronome for their work. In this deliberate stillness, the act of chronicling feels less like prophecy and more like quiet stewardship of shared knowledge. When the day ends, the clouds drift apart, leaving a silvered sky that hints at the rain that never came. Myra folds the scroll, the ink slightly smudged, a reminder that predictions are as fragile as parchment. Aldrich looks toward the distant hills, his face softened by the fading light, his eyes seeing the same valley he has watched for years. He understands that the true forecast lies in humanity's patience, the willingness to listen to subtle signs without demanding certainty. The market empties, the lanterns glow low, and the valley rests, holding its modest wisdom in the hush between wind and stone. The mist lay heavy over the ancient stone circle as Myra and Aldrich stepped onto the cold earth. Dawn brushed the horizon, turning the granite into pale amber, and a flock of black ravens gathered on the outer rim. The birds moved with a deliberate rustle of feathers, settling on the northern stones with a soft thump that sounded like distant rain. Myra brushed the damp moss from her sleeve, feeling the chill of the morning breeze curl around her wrists. Aldrich traced the pattern of the stones with his gaze, noting how the birds' quiet presence seemed to outline an invisible map. Over the next few mornings, they recorded that whenever the ravens perched on the northern stones, a sharp wind began to sweep the valley, rattling the thatch roofs of nearby farms. When the birds shifted to the southern oaks, the sky darkened and a steady rain fell, washing the clay paths into slick ribbons. The duo presented their notes to the local council, the noble's hall echoing with the scrape of parchment and the low murmur of skeptical voices. A lord in a fur-lined coat gestured dismissively, his fingers tapping the edge of his goblet, as if the feathered omen were simply a weathered superstition. Yet the wind outside the hall began to howl, and the scent of wet earth seeped through the stone shutters, lending a damp weight to the debate. The nobles, proud of their learned astronomers, claimed the stars alone governed the climate, while their own court prophet kept his face hidden behind a veil of candlelight. They laughed at the ravens' modest chorus. Yet that very night, a sudden gust tore the prophet's scrolls from the table, scattering them like discarded feathers. With each torn page, the council's confidence faltered, and a muted chuckle rose from Myra, who had watched the birds settle calmly on the stones all along. Aldrich noted the irony in the silence that followed. The court's learned men were outmatched by creatures that never spoke of prophecy, only of instinct. The hall fell quiet, the only sound the distant caw of a lone raven echoing against the stone walls. As twilight deepened, the remaining ravens returned to the circle, perching in a loose V that framed the fading light like a dark banner. Myra and Aldrich sat on a low bench, the cool bark of the ancient stones against their backs, listening to the faint rustle of leaves and the soft patter of a distant brook. The nobles, now humbled, lingered near the fire, their murmurs reduced to the occasional sigh of warm air. In the quiet, the wind softened to a gentle sigh, and the scent of pine mingled with the faint smell of peat smoke. The night settled like a blanket, and the ravens, unbothered by human concerns, kept their steady watch over the stone circle. In the morning light, the duo walked away from the circle, their cloaks brushing against damp grass as they counted the days ahead. They carried with them a quiet conviction that the world often whispers its truths through ordinary motions, not grand declarations. The nobles returned to their duties, the rain having nourished the fields and the wind having cleared the haze. Each subtle change, unnoticed yet felt. Myra paused at a threshold, feeling the texture of the wooden door, and thought how human certainty is as fragile as a feather caught in a draught. Aldrich looked back once, seeing the ravens still perched, and allowed the stillness of that scene to settle into his memory like a soft sigh before sleep. At the edge of the valley, the two chroniclers watched the lowing cattle shuffle restlessly across the frost-kissed pasture, while a handful of goats edged toward a rise of wind-scarred stone. The air held the faint scent of damp earth, and the distant bell of the chapel rang as if marking a slow heartbeat for the kingdom. Their notes recorded the way the herd's ears twitched at a sudden chill that the sun had not yet announced. In the soft amber of late afternoon, a thin mist curled around the low hills, blurring the horizon like a watercolor. The observers felt the first quiet stir of a story that would tie animal instinct to human survival. By evening, the cattle began coughing, a low rattling that grew into a feverish shudder that rippled through the herd. The goats, usually placid, clustered on the higher ground, their hooves striking the stones with a nervous rhythm that seemed to echo the falling temperature. The chroniclers felt the air tighten, the wind turning from a whisper to a bite that brushed their skin. A sudden drop in mercury was recorded by the village steward, whose ink trembled as he marked the numbers. The urgency in the animals' motions pressed the men to gather their quills and race toward the market square before night fully settled. When they arrived, the townsfolk were busy mending cloth and sharing stale bread, their faces soft and unreadable beneath the lantern glow. The chroniclers raised their voices, pointing to the agitated herd and the trembling goats, yet the villagers smiled politely, accepting the warning as another rustic tale. A merchant laughed, noting how the animals seemed to overreact to a mere change in wind, while a baker muttered that some cold was expected anyway. The irony lay in the quiet confidence of human routine, juxtaposed with the animal's raw sensitivity, a contrast that felt both absurd and oddly reverent. Still, the chroniclers persisted, their words slipping into the night like a slow tide, hoping the subtle alarm would not be lost to the crackle of hearths. Soon the frost arrived, coating the fields in a thin veil of ice that glimmered under the pale moon. The cattle, now clustered in a narrow shelter, huddled together, their breaths forming thin clouds that rose and vanished. The goats, perched on the stone ridge, stood steadfast, their silhouettes stark against the cold sky. The villagers, having been nudged by the chronicler's insistence, secured their doors and stored food, moving with a measured calm that seemed to thank the restless herds. In the stillness, the night wind sighed through the trees, and the kingdom settled into a quiet that felt both fragile and resilient. When dawn painted the hills with a wan amber, the frost had thinned, leaving a faint sheen on the grass and a lingering chill in the air. The chroniclers recorded the lesson that the animals, without language, had spoken a warning that humans chose to hear. Their pens traced the soft lines of the day's events, noting how the restless herd had become a silent teacher of humility. The townspeople, now sipping warm broth, glanced toward the grazing fields with a gentle respect for the creatures that had guided them. In the afterglow, the story settled like a sigh, reminding future generations that even the smallest movements can carry the weight of survival. In the late autumn light, the village of Carrowfield lay quiet beneath a slate-gray sky, and the river's slow murmur blended with the soft clatter of wooden carts. Swallows, once bright against summer, now turned low and swift, their feathers skimming the cold air as if feeling the weight of coming rain. Wolves gathered on the hill's edge, their low howls humming through the pine, while the village dogs pressed their noses against the stone walls, wine trembling in their throats. Myra, the steward's daughter, and Aldrich, a monk of the scriptorium, had spent months noting each subtle shift, logging the birds' dives and the beasts' restless pacing in a leather-bound chronicle. On this day, they carried the worn tome to the great hall, hoping that the kingdom's memory might finally recognize the pattern of animal conduct as a voice of weather. When the heavy doors creaked open, the courtiers' murmurs rose like distant thunder, a blend of curiosity and uneasy anticipation. The king, seated on a high wooden throne, lifted his gaze to the parchment, the dim candlelight casting shadows that blurred his expression, as if his face were hidden behind a veil of cloud. Outside, the wind began to scrape the thatch, and a low rumble rolled over the fields, matching the uneasy rhythm of the dogs' whines. Aldrich spoke in a measured tone, describing how 50 winters past, the same synchronized animal chorus had preceded a storm that felled 3 windmills and flooded the granaries. The court listened, the tension palpable, while the swallows, unseen through the stained glass, continued their frantic descent, a silent metronome to the growing dread. A smile flickered across the king's aged cheek, not from amusement, but from a weary irony that history often repeats without reverence. A senior marshal, his armor dulled by years, chuckled dryly, noting that the village had once ignored a similar omen and suffered a harvest loss, yet now they presented it as a safeguard. The counselors exchanged glances, half skeptical, half aware that the wolves' howls sounded almost like a warning, shouted by the very stones of the hall. Myra's fingers traced the inked lines of their record, each entry a quiet testament to patient observation, while the court's laughter settled into a hollow echo. In that moment, the absurdity of relying on feathered and furred messengers underlined the human tendency to dismiss the ordinary until it presses too close for comfort. With a measured nod, the king signaled the steward to order the shutters to be secured and the grain stores to be raised on higher pallets, actions that felt both routine and urgent. The hall filled with the soft shuffle of cloaks and the faint creak of timber as workers moved under the dim glow, their breath visible in the cooling air. Outside, the wolves' howls rose in a steady cadence, and the dogs' whines softened as they settled against the stone, as if surrendering their warning to human hands. Aldrich closed his chronicle, the leather cover warm from his palm, and placed it on the table, a quiet acknowledgement that the recorded pattern had earned its place in decision. The storm rolled in, its first gust rattling shutters, yet the village stood prepared, its ordinary guardians, both human and animal, aligned in a shared vigilance. When the rain finally ceased, the sky cleared to a pale amber, and the river's surface reflected the softened silhouettes of swallows returning to their nests. The villagers gathered in the courtyard, sharing simple broth while the dogs rested, their ears drooping in contentment, and the wolves retreated into the woods, their presence now a subdued echo rather than a warning. Myra and Aldrich, their eyes tinged with quiet fatigue, exchanged a look that spoke of a lesson learned without fanfare. That patient observation of modest signs can guide great decisions. The king, his face still veiled in the candle's flicker, thanked the chroniclers with a modest nod, understanding that history's voice often whispers through rustle of feathers and breath of beasts. As night deepened, a gentle hush settled over Carrowfield, a reminder that the world moves slowly, and its smallest motions may carry the weight of seasons. In the cool gray light before dawn, the market stalls of Eldermere exhaled the scent of damp wool and fresh bread, while a thin flock of starlings skimmed the low horizon. Myra, the keeper of the town's chronicles, paused beside a weathered well to watch a lone hare tuck its nose into the soft earth, its ears twitching at an unseen whisper. The kingdom's stone walls, still damp from night mist, seemed to listen to the subtle shuffles of hooves and the rustle of low leaves. Villagers, their hands stained with flour, exchanged glances that carried more habit than hope, each trusting the quiet pattern of the day. In this ordinary quiet, the first thread of a larger story began to weave itself through the rhythm of animal motion. By mid-morning, the sky thickened, the clouds gathering like a congregation of silent mourners, and a low wind tugged at the banners fluttering above the gatehouse. The shepherds' goats edged closer to the stables, their backs arched and eyes wide, as if sensing a shift that the villagers could not yet name. A distant thunder rolled over the river, vibrating the stone bridges and making the water's surface ripple with an uneasy tremor. Myra noted the way the sparrows halted their song, their feathers puffed, and the cattle lowered their heads, a collective crouch that seemed a preemptive bow to an unseen force. The tension in the air grew palpable, yet the kingdom's people still moved in their accustomed, measured steps, unaware of the warning that nature whispered through every creature. When the first heavy drops struck the cobblestones, the king, perched upon his high throne of oak, regarded the storm with a detached curiosity, his beard slick with rain that fell on his crown like indifferent applause. The royal advisors, eyes narrowed behind polished lenses, consulted parchments that spoke of distant omens, while the palace dogs retreated to the warm hearth, their tails tucked low. Meanwhile, a pair of swallows, returning from the southern fields, darted erratically, spiraling as if to scrape the clouds themselves, their frantic dance a stark contrast to the court's composed indifference. Myra, noting this irony, slipped a thin vellum into the king's hand, inscribing the pattern of the bird's turns beside a note about ancient farmers who read the wind in the flight of insects. The king's brow lifted just enough to recognize the subtle message, and the palace doors opened to let in the scent of wet stone, and the soft clatter of hooves bringing the royal messenger to the village square. When the storm's fury broke over the western ridge, the rain fell in sheets that washed the streets clean, the scent of earth rising sharp and pure. Yet the kingdom emerged largely unharmed, the fields soggy but not shattered, the thatched roofs holding fast. The beasts, having retreated to shelter hours before, emerged afterward with calm eyes. A chorus of low moos and gentle bleats that filled the evening air with a soft, reassuring hum. In gratitude, the king, his cloak draped over a stone column, announced the founding of a guild dedicated to the observation of animal behavior, naming Myra as its chief chronicler. The guild's emblem, a stylized hare beside a rising sun was etched onto wooden tablets that would later sit in the great hall, a reminder that vigilance could be woven from the simplest of signs. The people gathered beneath lantern light, sharing warm broth while listening to Myra's measured narration of how the kingdom's safety rested on listening to the quiet language of beasts. Years later, as the kingdom's walls softened with ivy and the market's footfalls softened with age, the guild's records lay in a modest archive, their parchment pages yellowed but still crisp to the touch. Children, eyes half closed from the day's labor, would sit at Myra's old desk and hear stories of the great storm, the careful watch of a hare, and the unexpected humility of a king who learned to read feathered sketches in the sky. The legacy settled like a gentle dusk, an unassuming lesson that humanity's most reliable forecasts often come from the rhythm of hooves, the rustle of wings, and the quiet alertness of creatures sharing the same earth. In the soft glow of hearthfire, the chroniclers whispered that the kingdom's endurance was less a triumph of steel and more a patient conversation between two worlds. Thus, the kingdom rested each night with a quiet assurance, knowing that even the smallest animal could speak the weather's truth, and that listening required only the willingness to pause and feel. At the first light of spring, the valley of Greenfold stretched under a pale gold horizon, and young shepherd Elric lifted his eyes from the dew-wet grass to watch the sunrise bleed across the fields. Beside him, the village elder Myra, whose hands bore the soft calluses of many harvests, traced the thin line where sunrise met the far hill, noting how the early glow warmed the northern slope. In their quiet routine, they measured the faint steam rising from the damp earth, feeling the cool mist on their cheeks as a gauge of soil moisture. The villagers gathered around the stone well, listening to the soft clink of water buckets and the distant bleat of lambs, while Myra whispered the old rule that a bright, early sun foretells a moist ground ready for sowing. Together, they marked the day on a weather-worn wooden board, setting the rhythm for the planting season. Midweek, clouds gathered low over the ridge, turning the sunrise into a hesitant amber that lingered longer before breaking. Elric felt the wind tighten around his shoulders, the chill seeping through his woolen shirt, while Myra stared at the shifting colors, her brow creasing as the light waned. The villagers whispered about a possible drought, their voices low as the rustle of wheat stalks, and the scent of earth grew sharper, dry, as if warning of a forthcoming scarcity. As the sun finally rose, its heat was weak, and the soil underfoot retained a faint coldness, making the sowing of barley feel like an act of defiance against an indifferent sky. The tension in the fields was palpable, a quiet resistance that settled in the creak of cartwheels and the steady thump of a hammer shaping new plowshares. Evening arrived with a sudden rush of amber, and the sun slipped behind the western woods, painting the sky in streaks that the villagers had long believed signaled a gentle frost. Yet the night air held a soft, lingering warmth, and the first frost crystals failed to appear on the barley shoots, leaving the crops untouched by the expected bite. Myra chuckled quietly, the sound like cracked parchment, noting how the sky had delivered the opposite of its promise, an irony that the people accepted with a sigh. Elric watched the glow fade, feeling the faint thud of his own heartbeat against the backdrop of crickets, realizing that their careful readings were as fallible as the clouds themselves. The village laughed at the misread omen, their mirth mingling with the distant clatter of a pot being set on a hearth, a reminder that certainty in the sky was a luxury they could not afford. The following days settled into a steady rhythm, the sun rising and setting with a measured patience that soothed the uneasy hearts of Greenfold. Workers moved silently between rows, their hands brushing the soft stalks, while the rustle of wind through the trees provided a gentle soundtrack to the planting. Myra guided Elric in adjusting the depth of each seed, the feel of the soil yielding under their fingers, and the village children gathered stones to mark the rows, their soft giggles echoing like distant bells. As sunset painted the horizon in muted terracotta, the temperature dropped just enough to coat the new shoots with a thin veil of dew, confirming a mild night that would protect rather than threaten. In that calm, the community shared loaves of fresh rye, the taste of warm bread mingling with the faint scent of lavender from nearby gardens, a quiet celebration of a season moving forward without fanfare. As autumn waned, the barley ripened under a sky that had offered both bright mornings and subdued twilights, and the villagers gathered to reap the grain that had survived the uncertainties of their observations. Elric stood beside the thrashing floor, feeling the worn wooden boards under his boots, and he thought of the countless mornings when the sunrise had seemed more a promise than a guide. Myra, her eyes softened by years, traced the pattern of the harvested sheaves, noting how the small errors in reading the sky had become part of the harvest's character. The shared labor left a faint smell of dust and sweet grain in the air, while the distant lowing of cattle created a low hum that underscored the scene's quiet dignity. In the waning light, the villagers understood that their practice was less about perfect prediction than about attuning themselves to the world's slow breath, a modest humility that steadied their lives long after the last stalk was stored. At the first pale light of dawn, the thatched roofs of the village caught the shy amber of an early sunrise, and the thatched fields stretched their shadows eastward like quiet fingers. Elric, the eldest tiller, lifted his weathered gaze, noting the silver line where sky met earth, a line that, for generations, had guided the planting of barley. The rooster's low crow fluttered against the cool morning air, its echo swallowed by the rustle of dew-laden wheat. Women carried baskets of flour, their hands brushing the soft grain, while children pressed their noses against the thatch, inhaling the faint scent of wet soil. In that gentle moment, the rhythm of the day seemed already written in the sky's amber ink. By mid-morning, however, the sun lingered beyond its usual height, casting a lingering twilight that refused to surrender to the expected heat. The shadows stretched oddly, as if unsure where to fall, and the villagers exchanged uneasy glances over the low stone wall that bordered their fields. Elric frowned, his fingers tracing the familiar sun-dial etched into the courtyard stone, now appearing out of step with the lingering light. A low murmur rose among the women, a soft rustling like dried leaves, as they whispered about the crops that might sprout too early or wither too soon. The air grew warm, yet a chill lingered in the heart of the hamlet, a subtle doubt hovering like a thin cloud over the day's work. That afternoon, a messenger from the neighboring hamlet of Brindle arrived, his satchel clattering with scrolls that bore a new star-based calendar, its ink bright as the evening fire. He spoke in a calm tone, noting how the constellations rose earlier than ever, promising a more precise guide for sowing and reaping. The villagers listened, their faces soft-etched with curiosity, while Elric's brow remained furrowed, the lines on his cheek deepening like ancient furrows in a field. A faint chuckle escaped a young carpenter, noting that the stars had never dictated the placement of a roof. Yet here they were being asked to dictate the timing of growth. The irony settled like dust on the porch steps, a quiet reminder that progress often walks hand in hand with the familiar, both equally stubborn and hopeful. As the sun slipped toward its evening sigh, the villagers gathered beneath the low timber beam of the communal hall, the amber glow now softened to a mellow amber hush. They spread out rough parchment, comparing the old sun-dial to the new star chart, their fingertips tracing both with the same deliberate patience. A gentle laughter rose when a child pointed out that the stars, though bright, could not hear the plow's creak, and the adults nodded, their eyes crinkling with quiet amusement. The evening air cooled, carrying the scent of damp wood and fresh stew, while the distant river murmured a steady rhythm that seemed to reassure the uneasy hearts. In that calm exchange, the tension eased, replaced by a shared resolve to listen to both sky and soil, each in its own measured tempo. When night finally settled, the village lay under a veil of deep indigo. The lingering twilight, now a memory folded into the folds of the dark. Elric stood alone by the field's edge, his breath visible in the cool air, and he let the silence settle over his thoughts like fresh snow on furrows. He considered how the early sunrise had startled his certainty, how the rival's star chart had sparked both doubt and curiosity, and how the villagers' quiet collaboration had turned uncertainty into a gentle lesson. The faint glow of the hearth behind the stone walls reminded him that human lives, like crops, grow best when tended with patience, even when the heavens shift their patterns. With a soft sigh, he turned back toward the lamps flickering in the hall, carrying the quiet wisdom that every day is a slow turn of the wheel, resilient, yet ever-changing. The first light of dawn brushed the thatched roofs of the valley, turning the mist into a pale amber veil. Women carried baskets of wheat husks, while men tightened the thatch on the lower barns, their movements slow as the day stretched. In the center of the common, Myra, whose hands were forever stained with clay, raised a quiet voice to explain how the colors of the setting sun foretold the soil's readiness. She pointed to the thin pink line that lingered after the sun slipped behind the hills, describing it as the sky's gentle sigh. The villagers listened, eyes following the lingering glow, feeling the weight of centuries in a single breath. As the sun fell, a low grumble rolled over the hills, carrying the scent of wet stone. Dark clouds gathered in a hurried march, their edges sharp as a blade, bruising the orange horizon. The wind tugged at the loose straw, scattering it across the cobbles like restless paper. Myra pressed a palm against her cheek, feeling the chill that announced rain before it struck. The villagers exchanged uneasy looks, the growing pressure in the air echoing the decision they would soon have to make. When the first drops fell, the sky's pink wash faded to a muddy gray, and some younger hands assumed the storm meant the earth was already saturated. An old farmer chuckled, recalling a tale of a similar storm that had arrived too early and forced a crop to rot. Yet Myra smiled thinly, noting that the storm's timing, measured against the length of the morning glow, was the very signal they had been taught to trust. The irony lay in the villagers' haste to abandon the field, while the sky silently offered a different reading. Their quiet laughter softened into a collective pause, each breath holding both doubt and curiosity. The rain softened, tapping a steady rhythm on the rooftops, and the clouds began to thin like a sigh exhaled. Myra guided the group back to the western edge of the field, where the sunrise of the next day would linger longer on the dew-kissed furrows. She measured the pale gold that rose after the storm, explaining that a longer glow meant the soil retained enough moisture to welcome new seeds. With steady hands, the villagers unrolled the old wooden plows, their wooden wheels turning in the damp earth with a sound that felt like a lullaby. The village settled into a quiet efficiency, sowing grain under a sky that now glowed a calm amber, the earlier tension dissolving into measured routine. Weeks later, the stalks stood tall, their heads swaying in a wind that carried the same soft amber hue of the day Myra taught them. The harvest brought a modest bounty, enough to fill the granaries and to remind the people of the patience the sky demands. Children ran through the rows, their laughter echoing the earlier murmurs, while the elders traced the faint lines of color that still lingered on the horizon each evening. Myra, now with silver at her temples, watched the scene with a quiet smile, aware that the sky had offered both warning and promise without ever raising its voice. In the quiet of the evening, the villagers understood that reading the heavens was less about control and more about listening to the slow conversation between light and earth. When the sun slipped behind the hills, the western sky bled a deep, steady crimson that stretched across the fields like a quiet warning. The women at the well paused their washing. The men at the thrashing floor lowered their tools, and a soft murmur rose as they all lifted their eyes. The hue, softer than fire, yet sharper than dusk, matched the old charts etched on the communal stone, where the elders once noted the link between red evenings and sudden cold. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, curious about the color that seemed to linger longer than any ordinary sunset. In that still moment, the village breathed as one, the air tasting of damp earth and the faint scent of late barley. By the time the last ember faded, the crofter Elric felt a chill crawl up his spine, an unfamiliar tightness in his hands as he recalled the frost that had stolen a harvest years past. The wind whispered through the thatch, rattling shutters, and the grainlings tucked in the furrows shivered beneath a thin veil of dew. A sense of urgency settled over the open square, where the council gathered around a low wooden table, its surface stained with ink and sap. They counted the days left before the first hard freeze, their voices low, but edged with a tremor that matched the quickening beat of the village bell. The urgency was palpable, yet measured, as each villager surveyed the seedlings with a careful, almost reverent glance. Elric, whose confidence usually rested on the steady rhythm of sowing, found his thoughts tangled like the twine he used to bind bundles. He recalled the ancient verses, their authors' faces forever blurred by the shadow of the hills, and wondered if the sky's warning was a superstition or a genuine guide. A faint smile broke across his weathered cheek as a younger neighbor offered a simple earthenware cover, a modest lid that had been used for storing flour. The irony lay in how such a humble object now held the potential to shield an entire season's worth of hope. With a quiet nod, Elric set aside his doubts, allowing the collective knowledge of generations to steer his hands. Together, the villagers moved in a slow, practiced ballet. The women spread woolen blankets over the tender shoots. The men lifted stone slabs to form a temporary canopy, and children passed buckets of water to dampen the earth, preventing the freeze from cracking the roots. The sound of cloth rustling and the soft thud of mud underfoot blended with the distant hoot of an owl, creating a lullaby of labor. As the sky darkened into a muted violet, the village square glowed with the amber firelight from hearths, casting long shadows that stretched over the protected seedlings. The effort, though urgent, retained a gentle rhythm, each action measured, each breath synchronized with the pulse of the night. By the time the last cover was secured, a quiet satisfaction settled over the fields, as if the earth itself exhaled a relieved sigh. When dawn returned, the horizon wore a pale, tender pink. The earlier crimson softened into a promise of resilience. The villagers gathered once more, sharing modest loaves and warm broth, their faces tired, yet subtly brightened by the knowledge that the seedlings had survived the night. Elric stood at the edge of the field, feeling the cool soil beneath his boots, and hearing the faint rustle of leaves greeting the morning breeze. In the quiet reflection that followed, he understood that the sky's colors were not mere omens, but a dialogue between earth and sky, spoken in shades and heard in the steady hands of those who listen. The day moved forward slowly, each step marked by the same patient cadence that had saved their crops, a reminder that even the grandest cycles are kept alive by ordinary, measured deeds. At the first pale light of spring, the villagers of the low valley gathered on the western ridge, eyes fixed on the thin band of amber that brushed the horizon. The oldest woman, hands calloused from years of thrashing, lifted her gaze to the shifting clouds, noting the thin veils that foretold a gentle rain. Men in woolen tunics brushed dew from their boots, while children traced the sun's path with small sticks on the damp earth. A soft wind carried the scent of thawing soil, and the distant clatter of a water wheel turned into a quiet metronome for their observations. In the hush, each breath seemed packed with the sky, a tentative promise of growth to come. Weeks slipped forward, and the sky grew restless, bruised by low thunderheads that lingered like uneasy thoughts over the fields. The same ridge was now a stage for sporadic gusts that rattled the thatch roofs, and the villagers felt the first sting of doubt as seedlings bowed under an unsteady wind. The elders' fingers traced darker patterns in the clouds, whispering of a possible drought if the sun lingered too long. Men tightened the rope of the harvest cart, their muscles taut as the tension in the air, while women pressed their palms to the warm stone walls, seeking reassurance. Even the usually steady rooster seemed to hesitate, its crow echoing softer, as if the day itself held its breath. When the first heavy rain arrived, it came with a sudden, almost comical ferocity, drenching the thatch and splashing the cobblestones in a gleeful splash. The villagers, caught in mismatched umbrellas, laughed at the irony of a sky that had promised restraint, yet delivered an exuberant deluge. The old woman's hat slipped, revealing a crown of silvery hair, and a young shepherd, drenched to the bone, slipped on a puddle, sending a sack of barley rolling into a nearby gutter. Their laughter rang against the stone walls, a soft, shared acknowledgement that even careful sky reading could be humbled by nature's caprice. In that moment, the tension dissolved into a gentle, absurd tableau of mud-splattered smiles. By evening, the rain softened to a mist, and a golden sunrise unfurled over the newly glistening fields, confirming that the crops had survived the tumult. The villagers gathered around a low wooden table, sharing coarse bread and warm cheese, while the last light painted the thatch roofs in amber. Each face relaxed in a quiet contentment. Children rested their elbows on the table, eyes half closed, listening to the low murmur of the river that now sang a steady, soothing rhythm. The elder placed a small, hand-carved wooden token on the table, a symbol of the communal resolve that had held the season together. As the sun slipped lower, a soft sigh seemed to rise from the earth itself, wrapping the gathering in a calm that felt both earned and inevitable. When night settled, the villagers lingered by the fire, their shadows flickering against the stone walls, and spoke in low tones about the patterns they had watched. The youngest apprentice pressed his palm to the warm ember, feeling the lingering heat as a reminder of the day's labor and the night's promise. The elder recounted the sky's cues, his voice a steady whisper, ensuring that the next generation would read the clouds with the same patient respect. A subtle melancholy rested in the air, a recognition that each season's end is both a farewell and a prelude, stitched together by countless small gestures. In the silence that followed, the village rested, its heart beating gently to the rhythm of a world that continues, unhurried, beyond their modest lives. In the mist-shrouded valley of St. Eldrick, the stone walls of the priory glowed faintly as dusk settled, and Brother Aldrich, his habit damp with the day's labor, heard the soft knock of Myra, the village's elder, whose hands were always dusted with herbs. She invited him to the nightly gathering of skywatchers, a modest circle of villagers seated on rough-hewn benches beneath a low arched roof. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke, while a curtain of low clouds drifted lazily over the hills. Aldrich followed, feeling the weight of centuries of quiet observation settle on his shoulders. The scene unfolded with a gentle rustle of cloaks and the muted murmur of voices, a beginning as unassuming as a sunrise over a quiet field. As the council lifted their eyes, the clouds above began to braid into thin, feathered strips that seemed to flicker with a faint, restless glow, prompting Myra to trace the patterns with a trembling finger. The wind whispered through the eaves, carrying a chill that raised goose flesh on the backs of those gathered, and a distant clap of thunder hinted at a storm far beyond the valley's rim. Aldrich sensed an undercurrent of unease, a collective tightening of breath, as if the sky itself were holding its breath for an unseen change. The villagers exchanged glances, their faces shadowed by the soft lantern light, each pause amplifying the tension that settled like damp wool. In that moment, the ordinary act of watching the weather felt like the prelude to an unsettled future. Myra spoke of old omens, recounting a tale of a hidden prophet whose face was forever veiled by a halo of rain, a figure described only by the echo of his words rather than any clear sight. The monks listened, aware that their own scriptures spoke of divine signs, yet the irony lay in the shared silence that followed each vague prophecy. The sky's shifting palette, pale gray turning amber, mirrored the subtle humor of human attempts to name the unknowable, as if the heavens were politely mocking their earnest efforts. Aldrich noted the contrast between the reverent hush of the priory and the practical chuckle of the villagers, both trying to read the same cloud with different tongues. The irony rested not in the failure to predict, but in the gentle acceptance that some mysteries remain comfortably out of reach. When the wind finally settled, the council lingered in quiet observation, each breath syncing with the slow rhythm of the night. The stone floor beneath their boots grew cool, and a faint pine scent drifted from a nearby hearth where a pot of stew simmered unnoticed. They recorded the cloud's shape in a weather-worn ledger, the ink blotting slightly in the damp air, while a candle flickered, casting soft shadows that softened the lines of their weary faces. The evening deepened into a calm blue, and the distant storm, having passed unseen, left behind a clean, silvered sky that seemed to approve of their patient watch. In that tranquil pause, the act of waiting felt as meaningful as any proclamation, a measured exhale shared among strangers bound by the same horizon. When dawn finally brushed the valley with pale gold, the skywatchers dispersed, leaving the ledger open on a page marked with tentative symbols and half-written prayers, Aldrich returned to his cell, the scent of fresh bread lingering in the corridor, and reflected on the night's quiet lesson that human perception, however diligent, remains a modest lens against the vastness above. The villagers, their chores resumed, carried the memory of the clouds like a small, warm stone in their pockets, a reminder of both vulnerability and resilience. The valley settled back into its routine. The rivers murmur a steady backdrop to daily life, while the sky, ever indifferent, continued its slow, patient drift. In the soft hush of morning, the story of that night became another gentle layer in the long, unhurried tapestry of St. Eldric's history. When the first mist of autumn settled over the low hills, Aldrich lifted his ink-stained quill to record the murmurs of the clouds, while Myra, her sleeves dusted with flax, recited the verses that had bound weather to the village's moral rhythm for generations. The rooster's sharp crow cut through the chill, a timely reminder that each feathered glide across the sky was a spoken warning. Children gathered near the stone well, eyes following the slow drift of geese, while the elder women turned wheat stalks and whispered prayers to unseen faces hidden by the waning light. The scent of damp earth mixed with the faint smoke of hearths, making the air feel both heavy and hopeful. As the days shortened, the villagers consulted the sky as they would a neighbor, believing that a lone sparrow's sudden dive foretold rain for the fields. Aldrich's notebook filled with careful sketches of cloud shapes, each line a tentative bridge between observation and omen. Mid-October brought a sudden frost that silvered the lower leaves before the moon had fully risen, and the villagers awoke to a hard, crystalline crust on the vineyard rows. The cold bit into the backs of laborers who had expected only a gentle drizzle, and Myra's verses sounded hollow as the wind whispered through the naked branches. Aldrich wrote furiously, noting the discrepancy between the expected omen of a slow, south-westerly breeze and the bitter north-easterly that had arrived without warning. Cattle huddled together, their breath forming small clouds that seemed to echo the unsettled sky, while the rooster, usually steadfast, fell silent as if reluctant to announce the day. The community gathered in the barn, their hands clasped around mugs of warm broth, eyes shifting between the frozen fields and the indifferent heavens, feeling a tight knot of anxiety coil around their routine. In the quiet that followed, an old farmer chuckled, pointing out that the same clouds that had once promised a bountiful harvest now merely reflected the pale faces of those who watched them, their hopes blurred by the same fog that veiled the saints' countenances. Myra smiled weakly, noting the irony that the verses, meant to align moral conduct with weather, now seemed as static as the frost itself, a reminder that human intent could not coax the wind. Aldrich, still sketching, added a marginal note that the clouds were indifferent, moving as they pleased, while the villagers clung to patterns like moths to a dim lamplight. The children, unaware of the tension, tossed pebbles into a puddle that had frozen over, the splash echoing faintly against the stone walls. A soft, collective sigh rose from the crowd, a sound that acknowledged the absurdity of trying to read fate in clouds, while the earth beneath them hardened. Soon the frost softened under the gentle rise of the sun, and the villagers, guided by a shared sense of resignation, began to tend the fields with measured care, their tools scraping against the earth in a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. Myra resumed her verses, not as prophecy, but as a lullaby, her voice carrying the faint hum of humility through the thatch-roofed cottages. Aldrich set down his quill, his pages now filled with both observation and the quiet acceptance that some signs remain unreadable. The rooster, sensing the change, crowed again at dawn, its call a simple reminder of the day's start rather than a portent. As the wind shifted to a milder breath, the livestock moved peacefully, their restless pacing easing into a slow, contented grazing, and the villagers exchanged glances that held no grand expectations, only the comfort of shared labor. When the last of the frost melted into the river, the village gathered beneath the amber glow of the setting sun, each person holding a small wooden cup filled with the warm tea Myra had brewed. Aldrich closed his notebook, the final line a quiet acknowledgement that the sky's messages were as fleeting as the steam rising from the cups, and that wisdom lay more in listening to the earth beneath their feet. The children, their cheeks flushed from the cool air, whispered about the clouds they had seen, their words soft and unhurried, mirroring the gentle rustle of the late season wheat. In that pause between day and night, the community felt a subtle shift. The superstitions remained, but they were now tempered by a humble recognition of nature's own tempo. The night settled like a warm blanket, and the village, nestled against the hills, fell asleep to the distant hoot of an owl. A timeless reminder that some stories are best told in the hush between breaths. In the low valley, where thatched roofs huddled like quiet crowds, the wind whispered through the stone walls of the monastery and the cobbled lanes of the village. Aldrich, a scribe accustomed to copying illuminated texts, often paused his ink-stained work to listen to Myra, the weaver, who claimed that the hue of cloud and the scent of earth foretold the weather. Their mornings began with the soft clatter of loaves being broken, and the faint chant of monks whose faces were forever hidden in the candlelight. Villagers tended their gardens, their hands stained with soil, while old proverbs about the dragon's breath lingered on the lips of the elderly like half-remembered lullabies. The day unfolded with a gentle steadiness that felt as ancient as the hills themselves. By mid-afternoon, the sky darkened, and a low rumble grew into a fierce roar that shook the rafters of the lowest cottages. Lightning sliced the valley, flashing against the stone, while rain hammered the thatch until the thatch itself seemed to weep. The villagers gathered at the market square, eyes darting, voices hushed, as the old proverb about the dragon's breath being a warning of divine displeasure was spoken with trembling reverence. Aldrich felt the weight of the monastery's bells, their muffled tones echoing against the wind, while Myra steadied her hands on a wet spindle, watching the way the storm bent the wheat stalks. Fear settled like cold dust, and the communal rhythm of daily chores fractured under the sudden pressure of a perceived wrath. In the midst of the tempest, Aldrich stood at the threshold of the chapel, his habit damp, conflicted between the monks' whispered prayers and Myra's quiet insistence that the storm's pattern could be read in the shifting wind. The monks, faces forever blurred by the flickering candles, raised their chants, their words rising like smoke. Yet the villagers' eyes were drawn to the practical signs. The direction of the wind, the way the rain fell in sheets, the sudden calm that followed each thunderclap. The irony lay in how the same ancient verses that promised protection now seemed as helpless as a parchment against the rain. While Myra traced the storm's rhythm with the steady patience of someone who had mended many a torn sail, small groups formed, some clutching rosaries, others clutching tools, each seeking safety in a different certainty. The storm, indifferent, continued its dance, turning the village's unity into a patchwork of quiet dissent. When the wind finally exhaled its fury, the valley lay hushed, the rain reduced to a soft patter that sounded like distant fingertips on a drumskin. Smoke curled lazily from hearths where women tended to damp wool, and the monks, their faces still unseen, lowered their chants to a muted hum that matched the settling clouds. Aldrich walked among the cottages, his ink-stained fingers tracing the repaired thatch, while Myra stitched together torn garments with patient hands, each stitch a quiet affirmation of endurance. The villagers, now gathering under a single oak, shared warm broth, their laughter low. The earlier dread softened into a shared sigh of relief. In the lingering cool, the valley seemed to breathe easier, as if the storm had merely reminded the people of the thin line between myth and observation. As twilight painted the hills in a warm terracotta glow, the village settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and newly aware. The old proverbs remained on tongues, but now they were spoken with a hint of smile, as if acknowledging their own quaintness. Aldrich paused by the monastery's open window, watching the blurred silhouettes of monks disappear into shadow, and wondered how much of history was shaped by the quiet decisions made in such moments. Myra, her loom quiet, reflected on how the storm's pattern had been a language she could read. Yet it was the collective patience of the villagers that truly weathered the night. The air held a gentle chill, the scent of wet stone mingling with fresh bread, and the valley's heartbeat settled into a steady, unhurried pulse. In that stillness, the people learned that their imperfections, like the patched roofs, could bear the weight of tempests, and that the soft irony of forgotten myths could coexist with the simple certainty of shared humanity. The day had turned a muted gray as clouds gathered over the low hills, and the air carried the faint scent of damp earth and pine sap. On the ridge where the old stone circle lay, villagers in wool cloaks shuffled their boots, their breath forming small clouds in the chill that hinted at an approaching storm. Children clutched wooden whistles, while the elders adjusted their course, hand-stitched capes, eyes fixed on the sky that seemed to pause between light and shade. Myra, the village's keeper of lore, lifted a cracked wooden staff and whispered that the sun would soon be swallowed, a sign older than any recorded harvest. In the background, a distant rooster's crow softened, as if the world itself were holding its breath for the celestial moment to arrive. When the moon's silhouette edged across the sun, a thin, trembling crescent of darkness seeped across the field, and a collective gasp rose from the crowd like rustling wheat. Myra proclaimed the eclipse a decisive omen, insisting that the sudden dimming foretold a harvest doom and an angry wind that would strip roofs from the thatched homes. Aldrich, whose hands were stained by ink and charcoal from countless weather logs, stepped forward, his voice steady as the stone monoliths, and offered measured observations of temperature drops and barometric shifts rather than fatalistic prophecy. He spread a weathered parchment, pointing to a line of rain measured weeks earlier, arguing that the eclipse was a natural tide, not a divine threat. The tension between the ancient chant and the quiet data lingered, each word hanging like a droplet on the edge of a leaf. A small chuckle escaped the baker, whose flour-dusted apron rustled, as he noted that the same clouds had accompanied the previous year's bountiful wheat, suggesting perhaps the sky was merely indifferent. The children, eyes wide with the strange darkness, mimicked the elders' solemn gestures, then slipped a pebble into the shallow pond, watching ripples spread with an almost bored curiosity. Myra's face remained blurred, hidden by the shifting light, yet her tones softened when a wind brushed the stone circle, scattering loose sand like careless thoughts. Aldrich's measured tone seemed to warm the air slightly, as the temperature fell only a degree, the wind sighing rather than roaring, the village's heartbeat syncing with the slow rhythm of the eclipse's passage. The irony settled gently, a reminder that human fear often dresses ordinary, whether in grand narratives. As the sun reclaimed its shape, the light returned in a soft amber that brushed the stone circle's worn surfaces, and the villagers exhaled in unison, their shoulders relaxing as if a weight had been lifted. Aldrich folded his parchment, tucking it beneath his arm, and offered the community a simple plan. Gather extra grain, reinforce roof thatch, and monitor the wind with the same care they applied to their daily chores. Myra lowered her staff. A faint smile hinted behind her concealed visage, acknowledging that the omen could be met with practical preparation rather than dread. The crowd dispersed slowly, returning to hearths and fields, their steps measured, the stone circle remaining quiet, its stones absorbing the last traces of dusk. The storm, now a distant rumble, seemed less a threat and more a reminder of the world's steady pulse. Later, seated by the firelight, the villagers reflected on the day's quiet confrontation, noting how the eclipse had drawn a line between ancient superstition and careful observation without breaking the thread of community. They whispered about the blurred faces of destiny, recognizing that knowledge and belief could coexist like two candles sharing a single wick. Aldrich recorded the event in his ledger, noting not only the temperature shift, but also the collective sigh that followed the darkness, a subtle metric of human resilience. Myra kept a small, smooth stone from the circle, its surface worn smooth by generations, as a token of the lesson that symbols hold power only when the people assign it. In the calm that settled over the hills, the night wrapped the village in a soft, beige glow, leaving the world to turn slowly, as it always had, beyond the reach of both eclipse and fear. In the low valleys of Lorne, the thatch-roofed cottages gathered under a sky painted with lingering clouds, while the scent of damp earth rose from the fields that had known drought for months. Elders whispered of forgotten prophets whose faces were forever veiled by the flickering torchlight, their riddles tied to the wind's direction. Young Aldrich, a wandering scholar with a satchel of brass instruments, arrived with a notebook and a calm curiosity, noting the subtle shift of cirrus and the murmur of distant thunder. The villagers welcomed him with modest hospitality, offering stale bread and warm broth, their hands rough from turning soil. As night settled, the hearth's glow seemed to listen to both myth and measurement, poised at the edge of a new awareness. One evening, a thin silver sliver of the sun's face slipped behind the moon, casting an eerie hush over the ridge, and the villagers stared, breath held, the sudden darkness. The old woman by the well muttered a prayer to the unseen guardian, whose visage was forever shrouded, while children clutched their cloaks tighter against the chill. The wind grew sharp, rattling shutters, and a low rumble rolled across the hills, stirring dust that whispered of an approaching storm. Fear settled like a heavy cloth, each crack of distant thunder echoing the old tales of omen and wrath. Aldrich, his eyes fixed on the shifting clouds, recorded the pressure drop with a steady hand, his instruments ticking softly against the growing unrest. When the first heavy drops struck the parched ground, a quiet irony unfolded. The rain arrived not as a divine curse, but as the predictable result of the falling barometer Aldrich had noted earlier. The villagers, initially startled by the sudden deluge, paused to watch the water carve ribbons across the stone paths, glistening under the dim lantern light. Their faces, once furrowed with dread, softened as they realized the storm was less a wrathful punishment and more a natural rhythm they could sense. Aldrich's notebook, open on a rough wooden table, displayed neat columns that matched the rhythm of the rain, a silent dialogue between numbers and the sky. A murmur of laughter, low and bemused, rose from the group as they exchanged glances, recognizing the subtle comedy of their own apprehensions. The rain lingered, soaking the cracked earth, and the scent of wet soil rose, comforting the farmers who felt the cool mud between their fingertips. Children splashed in shallow puddles, their giggles echoing against the thatched roofs, while mothers washed dishes in the softened light, their motions slow and deliberate. Aldrich guided the villagers in noting the wind's direction, the cloud formations, and the timing of each gust, turning observation into a shared ritual. The old tales were not discarded. Instead, they were spoken softly between tasks, their narratives now woven with the cadence of measured observation. As the clouds thinned and a pale sun returned, the fields glistened, and a collective sigh of relief drifted through the air, a calm breath after the storm's crescendo. In the days that followed, the village embraced a quiet balance, keeping the blurred legends of unseen prophets alongside Aldrich's charts of pressure and temperature. Harvesters moved through the rows of wheat, their hands brushing golden stalks, while occasional glances toward the sky reminded them of both mythic warning and empirical cue. The evening gatherings at the communal fire took on a new tone. Stories were told with a wry smile, acknowledging the absurdity of fearing clouds while respecting their undeniable sway. This tempered reverence taught the people that certainty and wonder could coexist, each tempering the other's excess. As night deepened, the distant hoot of an owl and the soft rustle of leaves became a lullaby, sealing a history written not just in stone, but in the measured breath of the wind, in the cold autumn of the great famine, the village of Winden lay quiet beneath a gray sky, and the thin breath of cold wind whispered through the thatched roofs. Young Alaric, his hands still raw from the last harvest, stood beside the elder Myra, whose skin bore the map of many seasons. They lifted their eyes to the western hills, where low clouds gathered like a reluctant blanket over the distant forest. The wind slipped eastward, carrying the faint scent of damp earth, while the distant crows called in a rhythm that seemed to count the days left. In that still moment, the two felt the weight of the coming year settle like dust on their shoulders. Soon the wind shifted without warning, turning sharply from the south, and the clouds thinned, exposing the bare stone of the hills to a harsh, unyielding sun. Alaric watched the wheat sway impatiently, its stalks bending in a direction that felt opposite to the promise of rain. Myra traced the faint lines of the sky with a trembling finger, noting that the morning gust now smelled of burnt straw instead of fertile mud. The village women whispered in the hearth, their voices trembling like dry leaves, and the men tightened the ropes of their carts, fearing the fields would crack under the heat. The tension in the air grew palpable, as each breath seemed to carry the possibility of another failed sowing. Yet in the quiet hours before noon, a thin veil of cloud rolled back from the western ridge, and the wind, stubborn as ever, softened to a gentle sigh from the same direction it had taken months before. Alaric, half amused and half weary, noticed that the soil beneath his boots felt cooler, as if the earth remembered a secret it had kept hidden for years. Myra smiled faintly, realizing that the pattern of low clouds over the hills had consistently preceded a surge of moisture in the soil, regardless of the wind's erratic chatter. The irony was soft, like a chuckle from the land itself, that such a simple sign could outwit the louder warnings of the wind. Their laughter, low and tentative, blended with the rustle of barley leaves, acknowledging the quiet lesson the horizon offered. With this newfound rhythm, the villagers adjusted their planting schedule, sowing barley when the clouds gathered low and wheat when the wind lingered from the west. The days settled into a gentle cadence. The morning light filtered through a thin mist. The fields soaked the dampness, and the afternoons warmed the newly sprouted shoots. Alaric felt his hands growing steadier as he tended the rows, and Myra guided the younger ones with a voice as calm as the evening breeze. The village market filled with modest baskets of grain, their weight a modest comfort against the lingering memory of famine. In the soft glow of the hearth, the community shared a quiet meal, the crackle of fire echoing the steady pulse of the fields beyond the walls. When the harvest moon rose high, casting a pale amber over the western hills. Alaric and Myra walked along the ridge, their silhouettes blending with the lingering clouds. They reflected on how the sky, indifferent and patient, had offered them a simple cipher, and how their own careful watching turned that cipher into sustenance. The village, now steadier, seemed to breathe in rhythm with the wind, each gust a reminder of the subtle balance between uncertainty and understanding. Their lives, marked by small imperfections, carried a quiet gratitude for the ordinary miracle of a cloud that knew when to linger. As night deepened, the village fell into a hushed lull, the earth holding the promise of future seasons in its quiet, enduring soil. When the first thaws of spring brushed the low hills, Alaric stood at the edge of the field and felt the western breeze glide over the thatch roofs, stirring the thin ribbons of cirrus that stretched like pale threads across the pale sky. The wind carried a cool whisper that brushed his cheek and brushed the hushed murmurs of the village, prompting the elder women to sweep the stone paths with steady, unhurried motions. In the distance, the river sang a low, steady murmur, its surface reflecting the pale clouds with a gentle tremor. Alaric noted the subtle shift in temperature, a faint green that began to pulse in the grass, and he sensed that the season was already speaking in a language older than any sermon. The air felt calm, as if the world itself were turning a page to a new, quiet chapter. By midday, a sudden gust slipped in from the south, thicker and heavier than the western sigh, dragging low, dark cumulus that gathered like damp wool over the horizon. The gust rattled the shutters of the bakehouse, sending a brief clatter of wooden boards, while the scent of wet earth rose from the fields, heavy with the promise of rain. Alaric watched the soil, still soft from the thaw, begin to cling to his boots, each step leaving a deeper imprint than the last. The villagers gathered in the square, their voices low, eyes tracking the looming clouds as the wind moaned through the thatch. A tension that settled like a thin mist over their thoughts. The forewarning of waterlogged fields pressed upon them, a weight that made the earlier optimism feel suddenly precarious. Yet the farmers, ever pragmatic, turned the impending storm into a quiet joke, muttering about the fickle moods of the sky, as if the clouds themselves were old friends playing tricks. They decided, with a half smile, to sow the legumes earlier than the customary calendar, slipping seeds into the damp ground before the rain could claim the furrows. The motion of their hands was deliberate, the feel of cold seed slipping between fingers, a small comfort against the larger uncertainty overhead. Children giggled as they watched the elders work, the sound of their laughter rising above the rustle of leaves stirred by the lingering wind. The irony lay not in the weather, but in the way the villagers, accustomed to the slow rhythm of seasons, embraced a sudden acceleration with a calm that seemed almost rehearsed. When the rain finally fell, it arrived in a soft, misty veil rather than the torrent many had feared, and the fields absorbed it with a gentle sigh. The western wind returned, steady and mild, coaxing the clouds to drift back into thin, translucent bands that once again hinted at clear skies. Alaric felt the earth's cool moisture beneath his boots, a reassuring texture that told him the soil would hold firm for the growing season. The villagers, now settled at their benches, shared loaves of rye, while the sun filtered through the leaves, painting the stone walls with a warm, amber glow. In that tranquil pause, the day seemed to stretch, each breath of wind a reminder that even the most sudden changes settle into the larger pattern of life. As twilight deepened, Alaric reflected on the day's quiet drama, noting how the shape of clouds and direction of wind had nudged the community toward a subtle lesson in adaptability. He sensed that the fleeting tension of the southerly gust had taught the villagers to listen more closely to the language of air and sky, a conversation that required patience more than force. The fields, now dotted with sprouting seedlings, stood as a soft testament to human imperfection, balanced against nature's indifferent rhythm. In the fading light, the western breeze carried the faint scent of lavender, a gentle reminder that every season, no matter how unpredictable, eventually finds its own calm. With a quiet smile, Alaric turned his back to the fields, letting the evening hush settle like a soft blanket over the village. The midsummer valley opens beneath a sky that has learned to keep its secrets, the fields of wheat ripening in a soft amber glow. Alaric, a middle-aged steward, walks the ridge, feeling the warm breath of daylight on his skin, while Myra, his sister, watches the distant hills where clouds linger like postponed thoughts. A gentle western breeze usually carries the scent of distant farms, yet today the air feels still, as if waiting for a cue. The villagers' routine milling grain, mending thatch, listening to the low murmur of the river, continues in a rhythm that feels almost rehearsed. In the background, the old stone well reflects the pale light, hinting at the quiet endurance of the place. The afternoon shifts when an unexpected eastern wind rushes down the canyon, rattling loose stones and raising a low hum among the wheat stalks. Towering thunderheads, dark as damp wool, roll in faster than any harvest song Alaric remembers, casting a shadow that slides over the furrows. Myra lifts the edge of her sleeves, feeling the sudden chill, and whispers that the ripening grain may be lost if the storm arrives before the thatch shelters are ready. Alaric's hand tightens on the wooden pole of the storage barn, his mind counting the days of grain that could feed the village through winter. Around them, the river's surface flickers, reflecting the approaching gloom, while the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer seems suddenly out of place. From the opposite hill, the lords of neighboring manors appear on the ridge, each gesturing toward the same wind-driven clouds, as if they were trophies to be claimed. They argue, voice rising, about who should command the irrigation canals that feed their own fields, despite the fact that the same eastern gust will spill water over all the lowlands regardless of any decree. Their banners flutter in the same wind that threatens to drown the wheat. A subtle irony that no one seems willing to acknowledge openly. A low, timbered messenger, his cloak damp from the spray, pauses to listen, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a hat, as if the very sky were a silent judge. The sound of distant cattle lowing blends with the rustle of leaves, underscoring the absurdity of human borders drawn against the indifferent sky. As the clouds linger, Alaric and Myra decide to let the thatch shelters rise, their hands working together to lift bundles of straw. Feeling the rough fibers brush against calloused fingers, the rhythmic thump of thatch being nailed echoes softly across the field, a steady pulse that seems to coax the wind into a gentler rhythm. By twilight, the shelters stand like modest shields, their muted orange hue blending with the earth, and the eastern wind, now tired, sighs through the thatch, scattering a few stray grains that settle like quiet punctuation. The river, no longer a frantic mirror, settles into a slow, steady glide, its surface catching the first stars that pierce the dimming sky. In the quiet that follows, villagers share modest meals, the taste of broth warm against the cool air, while the clouds drift on, unhurried. When the storm finally passes, the wheat bears only a pale scar where the wind brushed too close. Yet the harvest proves sufficient, a reminder that human plans are often shadowed by chance. Alaric watches the golden rose sway, the thatch shelters now standing as quiet witnesses to a season that tested patience more than strength. Myra, her hair damp from the earlier chill, smiles faintly at the sight of children gathering stalks, their laughter soft against the evening hush. The neighboring lords, having seen the water level rise and fall without a single decree, retreat to their own fields, the irony of their dispute now dissolved into the simple fact that the land obeys no banner. History, in its patient monotone, records the episode as a modest footnote, a moment where the shape of clouds guided both worry and peace, leaving the valley to rest under a sky that seems, at last, content to simply be. The village of Altenfeld lay in a shallow valley, its thatched roofs catching the sigh of a steady north wind that brushed the wheat fields each evening. Farmers adjusted their plowshares to the predictable breeze, and the wooden wind vanes on the communal hall turned like sleepy metronomes. Alaric, a wiry man with soil-stained hands, watched the clouds drift in thin ribbons over the hill, noting how their shadows slipped across the furrows. Children chased the soft rustle of barley, their laughter echoing off the stone walls as the sun warmed the amber dust. The rhythm of daily chores, milling, weaving, feeding the oxen, was as steady as the wind itself, and the air held a faint, comforting chill from the distant north. One afternoon, the sky darkened with a sudden clash of winds, a southward gust colliding with the familiar north, stirring the clouds into a restless, low choir. The wind howled through the narrow lanes, snapping the fragile vanes from their hinges and scattering loose thatch like startled birds. Rain arrived in hard, cold sheets, striking the cobblestones with a drumbeat that rattled the villagers' shutters. Alaric felt the earth tremble beneath his boots as the storm ripped through the cultivated rows, laying wheat flat like fallen scrolls. By nightfall, the storm had passed, leaving a thin veil of mist that clung to the ruined fields, and the village breathed a sigh as quiet as the wind before the tempest. In the damp aftermath, the villagers gathered amid the broken splinters of their once proud wind vanes, exchanging glances that mixed fatigue with a muted grin. Alaric, wiping rain from his brow, suggested they turn the fields toward the new prevailing current, a notion that seemed both practical and absurd in equal measure. The younger men laughed softly, noting how the wind that had destroyed their harvest might now guide a different sowing. With hands still chilled, they lifted the overturned plowshares, feeling the rough bark of newly felled hedges that the storm had loosened. Ironically, the very force that scattered their grain also exposed a strip of open land where a hedge could be planted, shielding future crops from the fickle breezes. The village council, half amused and half determined, agreed to reorient the rows, trusting the storm's lesson as a quiet teacher. Over the next weeks, the community worked in a measured cadence, planting rows at a slight diagonal to the valley floor, allowing the south wind to brush the tops without flattening them. Alaric supervised the planting of hardy hawthorn hedges along the new western edge, their thorny branches forming a living barrier that whispered whenever the wind pressed against them. The smell of fresh earth mingled with the faint scent of rain-soaked wood, and the villagers' movements became slower, each step deliberate as they tended the reshaped fields. Evening light softened the landscape, casting long, gentle shadows that slipped over the hedges, creating a pattern of light and dark that resembled the calm after a storm. The repaired wind vanes, now hung at a modest angle, turned lazily, marking the changed direction without the urgency of their former spin. In their quiet routine, the people found a rhythm that balanced respect for the wind's power with the patience of cultivation. Months later, when the harvest arrived, the wheat stood upright, swaying in the south breeze like a well-tuned choir, and the hedges kept the gusts from tearing the stalks. Alaric walked the rows, feeling the warm grain against his fingertips, and reflected on how a violent disruption had coaxed the village into a softer adaptability. The story of the storm lingered in murmured recollections around the communal fire, its memory serving as a gentle reminder that change arrives unbidden, yet can be embraced with steady hands. Children now played beneath the hedges, their laughter mingling with the rustle of leaves, unaware of the earlier chaos, but inheriting its subtle lesson. The village, tempered by wind and weather, settled into a calm that felt both earned and ordinary, a quiet testament to human imperfection brushed by nature's sigh. At the edge of the low hill, the villagers of Eldenbrook watched the sky each dawn, noting how the western wind brushed the wheat like a soft hand. Alaric, the young scribe, traced the thin, cirrus threads with his fingertip, feeling the cool breeze curl around his wrist. The scent of damp earth rose as the first light warmed the thatch roofs, and the sound of distant cattle lowing blended with rustling leaves. Women stacked freshly sheared wool beside the stone well, their eyes flicking to the pale clouds that hinted at rain. In this quiet routine, the rhythm of wind and cloud already suggested the shape of the coming harvest. By midsummer, a sudden gust from the north thrust the clouds into a restless swirl, and the wheat awoke with a shiver that seemed to echo the villagers' unease. The wind howled through the thatch, rattling loft shutters and stirring dust that settled like a thin veil over the market stalls. Alaric felt the cold draft on his parchment as he tried to record the shift, his ink blotting where the paper met damp air. The men tightened their belts, hauling empty carts back to the fields, while the women murmured about crops that might bend before they could be reaped. A storm loomed, darkening the horizon with heavy, low-hanging clouds that threatened to drench the grain before it could mature. And a knot of tension settled in the square like a stone. When the rain finally fell, it arrived in thin, ragged strips that traced strange, animal-shaped outlines across the sky, as if the heavens were sketching sheep in the wind. The villagers laughed softly, their faces half hidden by the brim of woven caps, noting the absurdity of trusting patterns drawn by clouds that seemed to mock their careful plans. Alaric, notebook in hand, recorded the event with a wry smile, noting how the direction of the wind had turned just as the clouds formed the fleeting silhouettes. The irony lay in their old adage, when the clouds walk east, the harvest walks west now turned on its head, with the wind walking south while the clouds lingered. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving a lingering mist that clung to the barley stems, and the villagers returned to their chores with a quiet, amused resignation. By the week's end, the wind settled into a gentle, predictable sigh from the southeast, and the clouds stretched into soft, white ribbons that drifted lazily above the fields. The temperature warmed to a comfortable amber, and the scent of ripe grain filled the air, sweetening the breath of each laborer as they bent to gather the bounty. Alaric felt the paper of his codex dry under his fingertips, the ink now crisp, reflecting the calm that had returned to the village. Children perched on stone walls, watching the clouds' slow parade, while the elders exchanged quiet words about the virtue of patience. The harvest was plentiful, the baskets overflowing, and the rhythmic thud of scythes against stalks blended with the distant, low hum of a flowing stream, sealing the day's serenity. When the last sheaf was stacked, Alaric sat beneath a lone oak, his quill scratching the final lines of his codex, a modest testament to the lessons learned from wind and cloud. He noted how the village's modest adjustments, orienting, rose to the prevailing breeze, and timing, sowing with the rise of predictable clouds, had turned uncertainty into steadiness. The parchment, warm from the fading sun, reminded him that even the most subtle patterns could guard generations against famine. A soft sigh rose from the surrounding fields, carrying the faint rustle of harvested grain and the distant chuckle of a child chasing a wayward kite. In the lingering twilight, the village exhaled, carrying forward a quiet confidence that the world, though ever moving, could be read like a slow, steady story